Who's going to step up and fill the Falcons' number 2 cornerback spot in 2024? It's probably not who you think.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, been covering the Falcons for too many years, far, far too long, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong in this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this pod that makes it your first listen or first watch of the day. And all you got to become an everydayer is subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, later in the episode, we'll be joined by Locked On Huskies host Roman Tomashoff to talk about Jimmy Lake. Right, we had Roman on to talk about Michael Penix. We'll talk about Jimmy Lake and Kevin King and Kaleb McGary on today's episode. And we'll kick things off, speaking of Kevin King, we'll talk about the Falcons' vacant spot at that CB2 spot. And when we're talking about CB2, we're talking about who's that starting right cornerback opposite AJ Terrell on the outside. And I think it's going to be a three-way battle between Mike Hughes, Antonio Hamilton, and Kevin King. I don't expect Clark Phillips to be in the mix there. I think Phillips is more likely to compete with D. Alford for the nickel cornerback spot as opposed to the outside cornerback spot. And again, that's not because I hate Clark Phillips. I think Clark Phillips is certainly a viable option as a plan B for the Falcons, but I am skeptical of him being their plan A, at least as far as the outside quarterback spot goes, right? And part of the reason I've reached this conclusion is because of the Falcons' recent signing of Anthony Johnson over the weekend instead of Jerry Jacobs, and Anthony Johnson being a 6'2", 205-pound corner with 32-inch arms compared to Jerry Jacobs, who's like 5'11", 205, has started 29 games. And the fact is that, like, if the Falcons wanted to get the best cornerback or the most experienced cornerback in the building, they probably would have signed Jerry Jacobs, but they signed Anthony Johnson, which to me means that the Falcons, are size kings and think size matters, right? And that's kind of the main disadvantage I think Clark Phillips has in this conversation is that all the size he's going to be giving up when you're looking at some of the receivers that he's going to face in the first half of the season. If he is that starting outside cornerback, guys like George Pickens, A.J. Brown, Mike Evans, A.T. Perry, Xavier Legette, D.K. Metcalf, etc. I don't know if you want Clark Phillips matching up with those guys, and especially if the Falcons are going to play as much zone coverage as we expect them to be. I don't know if you want Clark Phillips being asked to tackle those guys. And that was a big question mark we had of Clark Phillips coming out of Utah, where he made far too many business decisions when it came to run support. I don't think that was an issue last year, but he is a smaller guy, and it led to him struggling a little bit as a tackler. And we talked about, the thing with Clark Phillips is he has first percentile arm length and first percentile wingspan. And you've heard Raheem Morris talking about why the Falcons valued so much length. And they did a study. Raheem Morris said this, years ago, that basically, having that length and that wingspan allows you to be better at tackling, right? Having those T-Rex arms is not going to allow you to be a great tackler. And, given that the Falcons are likely to employ a zone-heavy scheme, tackling is going to matter, right? The whole point of zone is you're kind of funneling underneath targets. Like, teams are going to complete a large percentage of passes against your zone coverage, but you're only going to give up a few yards because you're going to rally to the football and tackle. And, you couple that with the expectations, whether you agree with them or not, but the Falcons pass rush is probably going to be near the bottom of the league this year. Like, that's only going to exacerbate that issue that you're going to need guys, because we're going to give up a lot of completions this year to go out there and tackle. And I just don't see Clark Phillips being that sort of plan A there. Instead, at the outside corner, I see him in the mix at the nickel. But of those three veterans, Hughes, Hamilton, and King, who do I think is likely to start? I think Mike Hughes probably has the edge. I think, part of that is due to Mike Hughes being probably the best tackler of that group. He usually, at least in the years where he was primarily an outside corner, he generally finished in like the 85th to 90th percentile when it came to missed tackle rate, meaning that he was at the top of the league in terms of fewest missed tackles. We've seen Mike Hughes historically. He has graded out much better as an outside corner than he has as a slot corner. We saw him play primary slot corner, and I don't think it's a coincidence that I was not a big fan of Mike Hughes last year. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that moving him to outside solves all the problems that I have with Mike Hughes, but I do think it does mitigate some of those issues given where he has performed in the past. You have Kevin King, who is a big physical corner, and he's probably at least in Green Bay, his reputation was he's much better in man coverage than he was in zone coverage. And you can kind of think of him as a poor man's Jeff Okudah, right? That was one of the things we talked about with Jeff Okudah. Great in the press man scheme that the Falcons were employing, but in zone, a lot iffier. Personally, I thought it made sense to be signing Jeff Okudah because I think some of his issues in zone, just because he didn't have a ton of experience playing in zone, in his days in Detroit, playing under Matt Patricia and Aaron Glenn in these man-heavy schemes. But obviously that ship sailed, and we'll see. But you don't have that same issue with Kevin King, right? Because at least under Dom Capers, they were much more of a man-heavy scheme early in King's career, which is why they drafted him, at the top of the second round back in 2017, I think it was. But when they moved off from Don Capers, I think beginning in like 2019, and brought in Mike Pettin and then eventually Joe Barry, they were much more of a zone coverage team, and King's struggles in zone tell me that that's not necessarily a guy that's going to be a great fit for you. Antonio Hamilton, we talked about him when we signed him, that interesting enough, he had PFF's second highest graded man coverage grade last year with the Cardinals. But I think there's a catch to that. Like Arizona was like bottom 5 in the league in terms of man coverage usage. So you had a very small sample size. And, Hamilton clearly played well when on the handful of snaps that he did play man coverage last year. But I don't think that grade is accurate. Like, he's this lockdown man coverage guy, as you would guess. So prior to last year, he was generally graded out better in zone than he did in man. And, watching him last year when he played the Falcons in that Cardinals game, I thought he looked more like a good zone cover guy, can keep things in front of him as opposed to a lockdown man coverage guy. So it sort of fits the eye test for me at least. And so I really think Hamilton's here to be more of a special teams guy. I think he's going to be the primary option at that gunner spot on the punt coverage team opposite, Kadero Hodge, and also, helping out on kickoff coverage as well, now that kickoff coverage matters again. So I think he's likely to stick in that role. It's notable to me that he was the only free agent other than, I guess you could say, Kirk Cousins, that had like a fully guaranteed contract. And technically Kirk Cousins didn't have a fully guaranteed contract, but Hamilton signed a 1-year deal with all of his money being guaranteed, which means the Falcons, there's a 90, I won't say he's a roster lock, but let's say it's over 90% chance he sticks on the roster this year for that special teams value as opposed to defensive value. So I think it's Mike Hughes' job to lose, in summary. We'll see if Kevin King or Antonio Hamilton could be in the mix. We'll see if Clark Phillips is going to be in the mix. But I think the main reasons why it's going to be probably Mike Hughes' job, Jerry Gray loves him from his days in Minnesota. Mike King is generally graded out well as an outside corner as opposed to a slot corner. Generally, his PFF grades as an outside corner has been in the 70s as opposed to much less than that as a slot. And he's a good tackler. And that's going to be important because he's probably going to get targeted a bunch, and we're going to need him to make a lot of tackles this year in the same way that we talked about years ago with Fabian Moreau. So, the bend but don't break back, the bend but don't break defense is back, baby. So we'll talk a little bit more about what our expectations are for this defense, especially under Jimmy Lake, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, it is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on anything from spreads to money lines, player props, NBA, NHL, MLB, and of course, upcoming NFL season bets, right? Schedules come out. You got your opinion on how many wins the Falcons going to have. Go on over to FanDuel. Check out the over-under, 9.5 wins. You're going to take the over? You're going to take the under? Kirk Cousins, MVP odds. Raheem Morris, Coach of the Year odds. And of course, got to give love to the NBA draft where the Atlanta Hawks have the number 1 pick. Is it going to be Alex Sarr? Is it going to be the field? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you can make every playoff shot count. FanDuel is America's number 1 sportsbook. So as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, guys, I want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel right here on YouTube, the first of its kind. And of course, you can also check it on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's giving you all the biggest stories across all the leagues, all the sports, NBA, MLB, NHL, horse racing, whatever's going on in the month of May. It's over at Locked On Sports Today. And of course, if you're looking for more local expertise, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube, as well as the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, talking bend but don't break defense, what is this defense going to look like? Well, it's going to be a bend but don't break defense, but we don't really know exactly what this defense is going to look like because Jimmy Lake, the Falcons' new defensive coordinator, is kind of an unknown commodity, right? At least last year with Ryan Nielsen being a first-time NFL play caller, we had 6 years of him in New Orleans being like he's probably going to borrow heavily from Dennis Allen's defense, and sort of that's our sort of template for success. We'll see if he's borrowing heavily from Raheem Morris's time with the Rams. And that's the thing where it's like Raheem's defense kind of changed and morphed over the years. But most recently, last year, they were primarily a cover 3, cover 4, cover 6 defense, according to PFF's charting, right? Those three coverages accounted for over 75% of their coverages, both in 2022 and 2023. Now, PFF's charting is a little different because like their charting of the Falcons defense is very different from my charting of the Falcons defense. Like their charting had the Falcons using those three specific coverages, cover 3, 4, and 6, 60% of the time last year. My charting had it closer to 40%. I'm not going to say PFF's numbers are wrong because there were numerous times, especially in the first half of the season, where I was charting the Falcons defense and I'm like, I don't know what coverage that is. I think it's this. I think it's that. But I don't know if it's enough of those instances for me to think to explain the disparity, right? For instance, right, PFF had the Falcons playing either cover 3 or cover 6 50% of the time last year. I had those numbers at 26%. So I don't know how they got their numbers, but who knows? I certainly don't think my numbers are 100% accurate on that, but that disparity it's hard to figure out. But we'll see on that. At some point later this summer, I'll probably go and watch some Rams defense. I won't do the whole season, but I'll probably watch 4 games or something like that, and then chart it myself and sort of see what's what. But I think in general, this general philosophy of this defense, it's been the case for the Rams the last couple of years under Raheem Morris. It's probably going to be the case with Jimmy Lake moving forward. We'll talk with Locked On Huskies host Roman Tomashoff, and he'll later on the episode, and he'll basically say it without saying it, but it's probably going to be a bend but don't break defense. And that is effective when you have an offense operating at a high level like the Rams did this past year, where their offense was pretty much, no matter how you wanted to measure it, whether it's points or yards or passing efficiency, expected points, third downs, red zone, run game, they were pretty much universally a top 10 offense in almost nearly every offensive category that you can think of last year. And that was the driving force of their success. And their defense just basically be good enough to not lose the game when our offense is firing on all cylinders like it was throughout most of the 2023 season. And of course, that's going to be to me, the biggest question with the Falcons is their offense going to be firing on all cylinders like that to that degree. And then that sort of bend but don't break defense that we're expecting out of this unit, very similar to what they were in the 2 years under Dean Pease in 21 and 22. That should be good enough for them to win enough games. 9 of their games this year are against teams that, if you're measuring by expected points, were like top 15 offenses last year. So we'll have to see if they have the firepower to outscore those teams. Because again, I don't think the defense is really going to do a whole lot to slow those teams down. So you got to match firepower with firepower. And then notably 6 out of those games against Dallas, New Orleans, Kansas City, and Tampa Bay, those teams also had top 15 defenses according to expected points. And so, it's going to be harder for the Falcons to score points in those games, theoretically, than it will for the opposing team to score points in those games. So we'll see. We'll see how that all matches out and how that all, falls. But, at this point, my expectations for the defense are not high. I think my expectations, they will take a step back this year. I thought last year they were kind of an average unit. They performed really well in certain areas, red zone, third downs. They were third in third down, fourth in red zone last year. They were like top 2 in run defense, depending on how you want to measure it. So they were really good in those areas, and they were okay in the other areas, right? Turnovers, pass rush, giving up explosive plays and whatnot. So we'll see if the Jimmy Lake defense, right, can be as good as the Falcons were in the areas that they were good at, like stopping the run and red zone and third downs. And if they can, then that's going to be exactly their formula for success. And assuming that the offense is good enough, like that's going to win them games and get them to the postseason. But, for me, I know you guys hate it when I say stuff like this because you're like, you're so negative. And I'm just like, look, guys, like last year we were very high on Ryan Nielsen, not because we were like, oh, Ryan Nielsen's incredible. But it was just like the Falcons actually are investing resources in improving their defense, right? The 6 additions that they made last offseason, David Onyemata, Calais Campbell, Bud Dupree, Caden Ellis, Jeff Okudah, and Jesse Bates, like 6 out of those guys wound up being like their 8 best defensive players last year. They've lost 3 of those guys. And now you look at the 6 investments they've made on defense this year, not counting the rookies. And anybody who knows me knows that I don't put a whole lot of stock in rookies coming in right away and making a big impact. But it's like James Smith-Williams, Eddie Goldman, Bradley Anai, Dane Cruikshank, and Antonio Hamilton and Kevin King. And it's just like those 2 things do not add up, right? And so it's hard for me to really believe that the Falcons defense has really made any strides from a personnel standpoint. And anybody who knows me knows that I tend to think that defensive success is primarily driven by personnel and not scheme. Like I would argue, again, don't hold me to this, but like it's probably like defensively, it's like 70% talent and 30% scheme. Offensively, it's probably like 50-50 as far as I'm concerned. So that's part of it that's questioning sort of it. And, we'll see what the rookies wind up being, but I think not too many of these. We'll see. I'm only dipped a toe in the Brandon Douglas film, but you heard what I thought about Ruka Roro last week. You'll probably hear what I think about Braylon Trice at the end of this week. I think both of those guys, could be really good in a couple of years. I don't think they're going to be great coming out of the gates. We'll see. And I know a lot of people were like, well, look what Raheem did with those rookies. And, I got 3 words for you. It's called Aaron Donald effect, right? There's a picture of him over my shoulder. We Falcon fans are very familiar with the Aaron Donald effect, right? Where, Dante Fowler had 11 sacks in his year in LA and then had 3 with the Falcons. And, whether you're looking at Leonard Floyd and so many other players, like playing next to Aaron Donald, basically like the numbers kind of tell us that that's going to pad your stats like 5 or 6 sacks, like just by playing next to Aaron Donald. And so like when I look at, the impact of young players like Byron Young and Ernest Jones and Michael Hoyt and those guys last year, I kind of feel like their numbers are a little bit inflated. Like, the 8-9 sacks that they were getting. It's like, that's probably, we'll see what happens this year with the Rams, but they'll probably get like 3 or 4 sacks this year is basically what I'm saying. So we'll see on that. So I have a hard time buying it. I know there are Falcon fans. Well, what about the Grady Jarrett effect? And it's just like, you guys know the Grady Jarrett effect doesn't exist because Grady Jarrett was out here doing great things in 2018, 2019, and 2020, and the Falcons still had the worst pass rush in the NFL those years. So, like, it ain't moving the needle in that regard. But we'll see if the Falcons, we'll see what's what on the Falcons defense. Again, I don't have a lot of positive things to say about the Falcons defense, so we'll leave that aside and put all our hopes and dreams in the offense. Just carrying this team across the finish line this year, and maybe the defense will surprise us. Again, the Falcons are betting on a lot of sort of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th year players as well as rookies. And of those guys that they're betting on, like I think a lot of those guys can be good, solid role players in the NFL. But in terms of like true difference makers, like the only 2 guys that I look at that I think have that type of ability are Arnold Ebiketie and Troy Anderson. And you need Troy Anderson in basically his first full season as a starter to kind of instantly be, a top 10, top 15 linebacker in the league, which he has the physical capabilities of being, but that's a major question. And then you need Arnold Ebiketie to essentially double his production and be probably one of the top 20 pass rushers, edge rushers in the NFL, and be like a 12 sack, 60 pressure guy. And if he does that, then great. This pass rush is going to far outperform my expectations, but I don't know if I'm ready to buy that level of hype based off what I have seen from Arnold Ebiketie in the last 2 years. So we'll see. We'll see if those guys surprise. We'll see if any of these other guys that I'm sitting here going, yeah, this is a role player, wind up surprising Clark Phillips, whoever else, Richie Grant, DeMarco Hellams. We'll see. But that's part of the reason why, like, we haven't spent a ton of time talking about defense because, like, Mama says, like, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. So I've sat out most of the offseason, like, I don't have anything nice to say. So we'll leave that aside. We'll talk with Roman Tomashoff, the host of Locked On Huskies. He's going to share his insight into Jimmy Lake. He'll also share his insight into Kevin King and Kaleb McGary. We talked with Roman about Braylon Trice. We'll play that later in the week. We'll probably get to the Braylon Trice breakdown here on the podcast later this week. So that will probably be somewhere, Wednesday, Thursday for you guys here on the pod. So we'll get to Roman's thoughts on Braylon Trice later, but we'll wrap up today's episode getting Roman's thoughts on Jimmy Lake as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, of course, there is lots of intrigue with the Falcons schedule. You got Arthur Smith returning to Atlanta as the Steelers offensive coordinator in week 1. You're going to have Patrick Mahomes playing for the very first time in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. There's tons of matchups that you can enjoy, and Game Time is going to help you take the guesswork out of buying tickets. I love Game Time's seat view, right? So you can preview what it's going to look like before you buy. And, of course, you can already picture. You can get that perfect spot for when, Patrick Mahomes is lobbing up that throw to Travis Kelce and Jesse Bates snags that interception and takes it 98 yards to the house. So, like, what seat would give you the best shot of that pick six? Of course, you can find that at Game Time. You can find not only NFL tickets, but, of course, tickets to comedy, music, theater near you. All you got to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Well, speaking of build the defense around, I got to ask you about Jimmy Lake, who's the new defensive coordinator of Atlanta and former Washington Huskies DC, and briefly head coach. And I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts on Jimmy Lake now? I'm sure maybe you had different thoughts a couple of years ago. I'm just curious where are you at on Jimmy Lake at this point in your life?
So I'm going to reserve all of my thoughts about him as a head coach, because that would be like a 4-hour podcast. We really don't need to get into that. So with Jimmy Lake as a defensive coordinator, he did such a good job of building a defense from back to front, where I know that's something Atlanta has struggled with in recent years in terms of defending the pass. I love AJ Terrell. I think that he's super talented, but I think that you're going to see, and especially combined with Raheem Morris, I love that combination of guys, where the more I look at it, the more I see just kind of what attitude I think Jimmy Lake could bring to the Falcons secondary. It's somebody who really does understand about keeping plays in front of him. When he was combined with Pete Kwiatkowski, who's the defensive coordinator at Texas now, they did a fantastic job every single year. Washington led the country in fewest explosive plays given up, where they did a really good job of keeping everything in front, never getting beat deep. And sometimes it'd be a little frustrating. I'd be the first one to tell you, because guys were playing so far off the ball, and that showed, especially during his tenure at head coach, but they just wouldn't give up a lot of passing yards. It's something where they always found a way to keep plays in front of them. And Jimmy Lake is one of the best developers of defensive backs that I have ever seen in my life, where, if you go back and you look through his draft history of guys that he helped place in the NFL, Marcus Peters is somebody who definitely was already on that track, but, Jimmy Lake gets a little bit of credit because that was his first season with UW. And then, of course, you look at Sidney Jones, Buda Baker, Taylor Rapp, Kevin King, who I know we'll get into in a minute, Byron Murphy, Trent McDuffie, Kyler Gordon. The list goes on and on and on and on and on of productive guys at the college level who he placed in the NFL that got drafted really high as well.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that Jimmy Lake said in his introductory press conference in Atlanta was, like, his dream was being an NFL defensive coordinator. And, I'm taking it like that his dream wasn't necessarily being a college head coach. And does hearing him say that kind of make you think, okay, that is kind of reflected in how his head coaching tenure in Washington went? Is that a fair way of looking at it?
That is a completely fair way of looking at it, where some of the hires that he made, especially offensive coordinator John Donovan, there was a certain aspect of he kicked his feet up on his desk and was like, yeah, the NFL is going to call me any day now, right? So yeah, that's certainly something that, nobody who covers the Huskies is surprised by in any way, shape, or form. And it always did seem to be the end goal, even, before that. And Chris Peterson did a really good job of doing his best to keep him around year in and year out, because he knew that one day a college program was going to come calling. One day the NFL was going to come calling. And, the way it worked out for him here at Washington is, I mean, not to get into the nitty gritty of it, but it was ugly to say the least in terms of, just some of the things that he did, the way he just kind of was around the program. But that shouldn't take away what he was before then and what he can be when he's not at the helm of the program, when he is running a defense, when he's doing the things that he truly is best at, and especially in a situation that we know he wants to be in.
Yeah. So, again, it's not just Michael Penix, it's not just Jimmy Lake, it's not just Braylon Trice. The Washington Atlanta pipeline has been going strong for years. They most recently picked up Kevin King, as you mentioned, one of the quote unquote success stories from Jimmy Lake's tenure in terms of developing NFL defensive backs. And of course, they used a first round pick a couple of years ago on some guy named Kaleb McGary. But I'm just curious, seeing some of these guys land in Atlanta. What are your thoughts on some of these former Huskies?
Oh, I love it. Kaleb McGary is one of my favorite players. He was just such and of course, as Falcons fans know, he's been through so much off the field in terms of his heart condition and everything. But I love watching him on the field, especially, getting to see him with Michael Penix. I think that's really cool. Obviously, their time at Washington never overlapped, but it's just cool to see those two guys working together, because in different ways, they really were just heartbeats of this Washington program. And then on defense, Kevin King obviously has not had the best NFL career. I'd be the first person to tell you that. And I'm a huge Kevin King fan, but he's somebody who I think can really excel in this Jimmy Lake defense as long as he stays healthy. That's the biggest thing. It's always been the biggest thing with him. I think he's going to be really, really good in terms of playing man coverage and a couple different things that Jimmy is going to ask him to do, because he got the most out of him for so long. And I think that while he's not going to be a Pro Bowl caliber corner, in my opinion, he's somebody who's going to be really solid on the back end of this defense.
Well, I think that's something that Falcon fans are potentially looking forward to, because there is an open question on who's going to be that starting corner opposite AJ Terrell. Obviously, Kevin King comes in with a lot of starting experience from his days in Green Bay, and has been out of football for the last 2 years due to injuries and other issues. And hopefully, the reunion with Jimmy Lake is going to lead to promising things for this Falcon secondary. But Roman, I really do appreciate you joining me again, sharing your insight not only in Michael Penix, Braylon Trice, Jimmy Lake, Kaleb McGary, Kevin King. I'm sure I'll be able to look at the Falcons roster later today and realize, oh, we didn't talk about this other Washington Husky that is on the roster. I probably should have Roman back on the podcast again. But again, really appreciate you, Roman. Let the people know what's going on Locked On Huskies all summer long if they want to, find out about the next future Falcon.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be talking about so much of just all of this draft stuff, where, I'm going to just really dive into the Michael Penix stuff, because I'm so happy to see that pick. I think he's such a fantastic fit with the Falcons. We're going to be talking about Braylon Trice. We're going to talk about all the 10 Huskies that were drafted, the 5 guys that have signed as UDFA. So we're going to be doing a lot of NFL stuff. And if you're more interested in just learning about the world of college football, since there is such a deep pipeline between Washington and the Falcons now, please feel free to subscribe to us over on Locked On Huskies, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to read more about it, I have a fantastic team of writers that love grinding in the film over at UW Huskies Wire as part of the USA Today Sports Media Group Network. And you can find all of our written work at uwhuskieswire.usatoday.com.
So that's going to do it for us here. Thanks to Roman for joining us and sharing his insights into some other former Huskies that are playing in Atlanta, not just Michael Penix and Braylon Trice, but Jimmy Lake, Kaleb McGary, and Kevin King. And I don't know what tomorrow's episode is going to be, because I got a whole bunch of guests coming on in the next couple of days, and some of those episodes probably won't air till next week, and then some of those episodes I might air tomorrow. So we'll see what's that all about. So I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about as the week unfolds. But of course, make sure you check out Locked On Falcons as your first listen. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Sports Today as your second listen. Locked On NFL. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every